everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. We are diving straight into some fascinating source material that explores how the era of Reconstruction laid a groundwork for civil rights that literally tested our nation for over a century. You know, when the American Civil War ended, the United States didn't just have to rebuild its physical infrastructure, right? It had to completely reconstruct its identity, its laws, and, really, its soul. This era, Reconstruction, was a time of immense hope, profound change, and ultimately some deeply unresolved tensions. It totally reshaped the United States, but as we're going to see today, its boldest promises were only partly fulfilled, and that left a legacy that generations of Americans would have to fight to actually realize.
Now, before we get into the heavy history, the source material actually grounds this whole analysis in a biblical call. It sets a really clear moral framework for understanding the fight for justice. Learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed. The curriculum emphasizes that history isn't just a dusty collection of dates and documents. It's the story of human beings either living up to these high moral standards or, well, falling short of them. So keep that imperative in the back of your mind as we evaluate the successes, the failures, and the ongoing struggles of the Reconstruction era.
All right, here's our agenda for today. We'll be covering the promise of Reconstruction, the long road to equality, protecting the right to vote, defining American citizenship, and finally, education, morality, and justice. Let's get to it.
Section 1. The Promise of Reconstruction, Reshaping the United States.
So in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, the nation was completely fractured. The federal government had to figure out how to weave millions of newly freed African Americans into the civic fabric of the country. And to do this, they turned to the Constitution. These three amendments were absolutely foundational. You have the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, the 14th guaranteeing citizenship and equal protection under the law, and the 15th, which protected voting rights from racial discrimination. Together, these remain some of the most important constitutional changes in U.S. history. They were sweeping, powerful promises on paper, but here's the catch. When the political will for Reconstruction officially ended in 1877, federal troops withdrew from the South. And without that enforcement, many of these vital protections just faded away, tragically giving way to decades of rigid segregation and severe disenfranchisement.
Moving right along to Section 2, the long road to equality, from setbacks to breakthroughs.
It's one thing to write equal protection into the supreme law of the land, right? But it is an entirely different ballgame to ensure everyday citizens actually experience that protection when they ride a train, or buy a house, or just walk into a school. There was a massive, undeniable gap between the constitutional promise back in 1868, the devastating Jim Crow-era setbacks like Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, and then the eventual turning point of Brown v. Board of Education in 1954.
These two rulings represent such a sharp contrast in legal philosophy. In Plessy, the court claimed that segregation was perfectly constitutional as long as facilities were separate but equal. In practice, though, this allowed brutally unequal schools, transportation, and housing to persist for decades, all under the guise of legality. But then, fast forward to 1954, and the Brown decision reverses course. The justices recognized a fundamental truth. Separating children by race is inherently unequal, and it profoundly harms learning and civic equality. Now, Brown didn't just end segregation overnight, but it absolutely breathed life back into the 14th Amendment, inspiring a whole new wave of civil rights action.
Which brings us to Section 3, protecting the right to vote, paper promises versus lived reality.
So you might be wondering, if the 15th Amendment plainly stated that states could not deny the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude, how are millions of citizens still blocked from the ballot box for nearly a century? Well, states created these insidious, seemingly race-neutral workarounds to suppress African American voters. They couldn't legally say, hey, you can't vote because of your race, so instead they implemented impossibly difficult literacy tests. They charged poll taxes that impoverished citizens just couldn't afford. They even used subjective understanding clauses, where a local official could literally just decide a voter didn't understand the law well enough. And all of this, of course, was backed by the constant, looming threat of physical intimidation and violence.
To turn those rights on paper into real, day-to-day protection, the federal government eventually had to step in with specific enforcement mechanisms. Almost 100 years after the 15th Amendment, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 finally gave it some teeth. It explicitly banned those discriminatory tests we just talked about. It authorized federal examiners to physically go into jurisdictions to register voters. And, crucially, it required areas with a history of discrimination to get federal permission, pre-clearance, before changing their voting rules. And the result? Voter registration and participation skyrocketed in places where suppression had been the absolute strongest. It just goes to show that constitutional rights require ongoing enforcement to actually be real in people's lives.
Okay, Section 4, Defining American Citizenship, the Wong Kim Ark Case.
Think about this for a second. Who is an American? Before the Civil War, the infamous Dred Scott decision of 1857 had declared that black people, whether enslaved or free, could never be citizens. The 14th Amendment was written directly to obliterate that ruling by establishing birthright citizenship, but it raised a really profound question. How does a nation decide exactly who belongs to it? Is it based on the blood of your parents, the color of your skin, or the soil on which you take your first breath?
The answer to that massive question actually came through a man named Wong Kim Ark. He was born in San Francisco to Chinese immigrants. After taking a trip abroad, he was denied re-entry into the United States on the grounds that he wasn't a citizen, simply due to his parents' nationality. Well, he fought this all the way to the Supreme Court, and in 1898, the court ruled in his favor, deciding that the 14th Amendment made him a citizen by birth. This was a monumental decision. It cemented a broad, inclusive idea of American citizenship that still shapes our nation today. It firmly anchored the principle that citizenship, due process, and equal protection belong to all persons born here, regardless of their ancestry.
And finally, Section 5, Education, Morality, and Justice, the Godly Learner.
So why do we even study all these setbacks and breakthroughs? What is the point of analyzing constitutional amendments and Supreme Court cases if it doesn't actually change who we are today? The source material reminds us that maintaining justice requires continuous vigilance. It echoes the biblical truth to act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly. Think about it. The people who instituted Jim Crow laws, who wrote those unfair literacy tests, and who defended separate but equal were often highly educated people. They knew the law inside and out, but intellect alone doesn't guarantee a just society.
The HeroesMart Academy curriculum intertwines this history with biblical morality, making the argument that knowledge without a spiritual compass ultimately causes harm. As outlined in the source, when asking about Reconstruction's successes and setbacks, their philosophy suggests that education without morality hurts. I mean, what is the point of being educated if that knowledge is used to make choices that hurt other people? When analyzing why discrimination continued after 1877, the curriculum points to Romans 8:6-7, noting that human nature without spiritual grounding easily defaults to selfishness and prejudice. This moral lens is exactly how the source material asks us to engage with this really complex history.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final thought to really chew on from the material. What lesson will you take from Reconstruction's mixed legacy? Will you remember that rights on paper require active, compassionate citizens to enforce them? History isn't just stuck in the past, right? It's the very foundation of our present, and how we choose to build upon it is completely up to us. Keep seeking to understand the stories that shape our world, and we'll see you next time.